Hello, welcome back to the YouTube channel of Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley. I'm Pastor Gervais Charnley. This is another Shropshire church. This is the church at Aston Eyre. It doesn't have a dedication, at least not one that's known. It's one thing to remember that at the Reformation, dedications to saints fall out of fashion. And although some of it creeps back in with Laud and the High Church party in the reign of particularly King Charles I, many of the dedications of historic churches just stop being used. And in some cases, as here, they're forgotten. There must have been a dedication. We don't know who it was to. Aston Eyre Church is built in the early 12th century. It's consecrated in 1135. The document has survived. But it just says the church at Aston Eyre. It doesn't say St Mary's or any other saints. The building is notably Norman. It does have some later features. It was restored, of course, in the 19th century. The chancel arch you can see behind me is an example of very late Norman work, what's known as the transitional period. The names that we use for English church architecture in the Middle Ages were come up with in the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, by a Quaker accountant turned architect, an antiquarian named Thomas Rickman. And Rickman comes up with a scheme where, first of all, you have the Romanesque, the Norman, the rounded arches. Then you have the transitional, which is where the arches are becoming pointed, and that's what you can see behind me is a transitional arch. But the decorative motifs and so on, that's the word motifs, the decorative motifs and such like are still the Norman type. And then after that you have the early English, which is really the 13th century. And then in the 14th century we get the decorated style. Now, of course, there is as the transitional style demonstrates, there is a transition between them. There are stages where these ideas come in. They don't come in at the same time everywhere in the country. And after they're decorated, it then transitions into the perpendicular, which is those glorious wall churches in the Cotswolds, for example, perpendicular. But this is Norman, and it's 12th century, but that chancel arch, you're just going from those rounded Norman arches to these pointed, what have quite unfairly and rudely been called Gothic. Gothic's the word we're stuck with. It's got nothing to do with the Goths. It is medieval architects who are working out how to make bigger and more impressive buildings and bigger and more impressive arches. So we'll have a look around and see here. This is an interesting period, the development of English church architecture. As usual, we start here at the west end. And you can see here we've got that curtain. That curtain has a very important role for the people sitting in the pew directly in front of the door, which is it prevents them from getting unpleasant drafts down the back of their necks, because that door, of course, yes, there's a porch, but the outside of the porch is open. Wind whistles through the gaps and such like, and you don't want people sitting in that pew to be too uncomfortable. The font is a very interesting one. Looks early 19th century. It's a bird bath type, really. There's this tiny little boarded box vestry here, which really isn't really useful for a vestry, but you can see there's a couple of coat hangers in there and a couple of hooks. The doorway is Norman. There's a tympanum. We'll see that when we go outside. It's one of the best tympanums in the country. This is an old painting of the church, and you can see there that the east window was at that point, and it's dated 1844, that the east window at that point was a single window with white tracery, not the current triple imitation Norman windows. But these windows here are genuine Norman. They're the same ones that are shown in the old picture, And we have these deeply splayed openings, but very small, deeply splayed, but very, very, very small at the end, because they've got to be, because they wouldn't originally have had any glass in them. Originally, you'd have had shutters, but basically you need something to keep as much as possible the rain out, so it needs to admit the most possible light and the least possible rain. Then we have this lovely transitional chancel arch. We've got there that zigzag moulding, and you can see it's quite thick on the inside. It would have had to be plastered on the inside because I thought it looked rather untidy. The pulpit is, well, at least includes some Jacobean woodwork. It's probably recycled, however, from a domestic setting and maybe even somebody's cupboard. And you've got these two figures here, not, of course, Christian figures, they're just random figures, because it's probably recycled. Lectern here. The pews have, well, you see on the end here, something that you've probably seen before. You've got these, what are they? Are they handles? No, they're not. They're umbrella holders. Because you come to church, it's raining. Where do you put your umbrella? Well, you can put it on the end of your pew and go through there very nicely. The chancel, again, we've got recycled Jacobean panelling there, probably domestic, probably not originally from an ecclesiastical setting. You do have a couple of panels here with an alpha and an omega. That's a very good imitation Norman work there. These windows again are, they're not Norman, that's square-headed windows, but later editions. A little choir stalls, and here you've got a little rector's stall sitting there. And at one point there would undoubtedly have been a three-decker, because basically everyone had three-deckers. They were extremely fashionable. We've got these nice early 19th century, or maybe even late 18th century, probably early 19th century, communion rails and hinged gate in them. The Church of England, from the Reformation era onwards, carried on this idea of kneeling at the table, and there's what's called the Black Rubric in the old Book of Common Prayer, which was put in really to counter people like John Knox, who said if you're kneeling at this table, you're effectively saying, well, it's an altar and we're worshipping the consecrated elements, which of course is what the Roman Catholics did. And it says, no, this is just for, well, we just kneel to, as it's a convenient way to receive the elements. There's no deeper meaning to it. John Knox, generally rather suspicious of all that, but that table, you can just see there under it, just see the legs, that is a 17th century communion table. The dimensions somewhat give it away. These tables tended to be smaller than Victorian altars, although this is a very small church, so you'd expect a smaller communion table. And so there we are, I've got this nice tiled floor. Originally the floor would have been trodden earth, so it would just have been ground and people just stamped on it until it was solid enough. Because of course there were no pews in the 12th century, no pulpit in the 12th century. There'd be very little beyond a font, and then of course the altar at the east end. People were supposed to stand, and if they couldn't stand, they'd bring their own stools and they'd take them home with them. And it's only later in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, that we start getting benches in churches that become then the pews, and these of course are early 19th century types. Open, they're not the old box pews, but it's very much a nice country church here. And that there is a table at the back for the literature on it. Would have had, I suspect, other pews there once, but not anymore. So that's the inside here at Aston Eyre. So here we are outside at Aston Eyre. You can see here, excuse any traffic noise, the church is beside a relatively main road. But you can see here, it's a simple, typical Norman building, two cell. You've got a nave and a chancel. You've got a little bell cot there. There's a porch, which is a later addition. And it's incredibly simple. This is the kind of church that the Normans built. It's a building that doesn't require a great deal of knowledge on the part of the masons, doesn't require a great deal of work. You can put up fairly quickly. And that was part of the concern, was building these churches relatively quickly, asserting the dominance of the Norman rulers, because of course the Normans come over 1066, William the Conqueror, as his nickname suggests, conquers the country, and England then is changed. The Anglo-Saxons did a lot of building in wood, so did the Normans, but prestige buildings the Normans like to build in stone, as we see here, and it is a matter, yes, very much of prestige. This is one of the poshest buildings in the village. The other one would have been the manor house. A few traces of that survive. I don't know whether the Time Team, when they went to it, is on the Time Team YouTube, but it's been explored by the Channel 4 documentary archaeological series Time Team. They discovered one of the barns here is the remains of the medieval manor house. We'll have a look around the outside and point out again these salient features here. So don't let the small size of the building fool you. As I say, this is a high status building. It's small because it's a small village, because it doesn't need to be big, and big is awkward. But the status is demonstrated really by the fact it's made of stone. The cottages would have all been wooden, and the fact that you've got this. You have here, this is some top-notch carving. Look at that. That's a tympanum, this panel above the door, and what you have here is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. You can see in the middle there's Christ on the donkey. On the left-hand side you've got a disciple and you've got a young donkey, and on the right-hand side you've got somebody who is putting palm leaves in front of the donkey. So this is Christ riding to Jerusalem at the beginning of Holy Week, and this is incredibly posh. It would have cost a great deal of money, and it is saying this may be a small church, but this is an important high status building. And again, the stone itself says this is a high status building, because non-high status buildings are wood. You've got this window, which is obviously been altered later, quite possibly been put in the wall later, pointed. There is no graveyard here. The church was a chapel, I believe, of nearby Morville. Morville had a priory, and God willing, a future video will be of Morville Priory Church. But here we have, you can see again the little Norman windows, this stonework. Some of it is best part of 900 years old, so no wonder it's a bit weathered. The chancel, again the typical Norman two-cell design, nave and chancel, and again you've got that nice, obviously you could have had a graveyard here, but they didn't, because right of burial was something that was reserved to certain churches, and if you got the right of burial, it meant that people in the villages, they might have their own place to worship on Sundays, but for burials they'd have to go to the main church. In this case I suspect it was Morville. The main church would also have rights of marriage. If you wanted a wedding, you have to go to Morville, and it might even have right of baptism. So for baptism you have to go to Morville. Morville's not very far away, it's just down that way a bit, down the main road still. So that is the outside here at Aston Eyre Church. And so there we have in Aston Eyre. Now, why would you have rites of marriage, burial, and even baptism at a different church? Why would the mother church keep those rights? Well, partly, of course, it's to do with asserting the fact they are the mother church, and secondly, there's money involved. Of course, there's money involved. But it's largely about status. It's only secondarily about money, because you're talking about medieval peasants. I mean, they're not paying huge amounts of money because they don't have huge amounts of money. The church has survived, quite remarkably really, and remains in use to this day. And it's open every day, it's on the road, coming out of Morville, headed towards Ludlow. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you until next time.